Thank you all for coming. I'm Chucker Finn with the Fordham Institute. In the very recent past, we published a little study that John Cronin and his colleagues at NWA did, and it's titled, "Do High Flyers Maintain Their Altitude?" Some people have misread it as attitude. And there are copies available along with several other valuable handouts on the table outside, including an overview of Josh's global report card, Rick's boring national affairs article, and Ulrich and Diana Epstein's response to our High Flyers report, including a very flattering and completely inaccurate description of me personally. I assume they read the High Flyers report more closely than they read my own resume. Delighted to have you all here today. We are going to have brief opening comments in the order. Hello, Leslie. Haven't seen you in ages. We're going to have brief opening comments in the order in which people are seated here. John is going to summarize the findings of this, I think, very interesting analysis. Josh is going to present a really interesting bit of analysis that he and Jay Green have done that loosely complements the NWA study. Rick is going to explain why he thinks the country is wrongly obsessed with closing achievement gaps. And Ulrich is going to grump about everybody else and explain why the country should continue to focus on the achievement gap it's been focusing on, which the Senate Education Committee will be addressing tomorrow at the first markup in memory of the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act. So it's a very lively, appropriate time for us to be having this conversation. And I'm glad you're here. If you hadn't detected it, one of the things that is on the minds of those of us at the Fordham Institute is that high-achieving kids have been neglected in recent years in American education. We're not blaming the No Child Left Behind Act for this. And anybody who says we are is also not reading us closely. We are, however, saying that during the same decade as the No Child Left Behind Act has been in operation, high-achieving kids have been neglected in American education in a whole variety of ways, and that this is posing a problem for the country, and that being focused exclusively on a single achievement gap is not a good thing for the future of the United States. That would be my view. I think that would be the Fordham institutional view, and that's enough by way of commercials, except that now you're about to see a real commercial, and then John will speak. So I haven't actually seen this except on a little tiny computer screen myself. So I think you're in for a treat, but I'm not certain.
In the last 10 years, a lot of attention and money were showered on our low performers. That's great, but did we forget about the high achievers? Meet the high flyers. These guys and gals are smart. Unfortunately, roughly 2 in 5 of these high flyers dropped off over the years. These descenders leave the ranks of the steady high flyers, but they're not crashing and burning. And as the descenders drop off, many late bloomers swoop in. There are even more late bloomers than descenders, so at the end of the day, we actually have more high achievers than we started with. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Those 2 out of 5 high flyer drop-offs are a serious missed opportunity. And those late bloomers? If they can do it, others should too. If we're really serious about educating all our students, we need to be checking in on our low, middle, and high-achieving students alike. To learn more, read Do High Flyers Maintain Their Altitude? Available now from the Fordham Institute.
Thank you very much, Joe. Nice piece of work. And without further ado, if you indeed still feel the need to say anything, having just observed that video, you are on, John.
That pretty much captures it all. So, Josh,
Okay.
It's all yours. Well, we could say a couple of things, I suppose. Good afternoon. I'm John Cronin. Ewing Jong, who's sitting back there, is actually the primary author of this piece, along with Mike Darlene. So all the blame goes to her. I'm only the third author.
Do what my boss tells me.
Let me describe briefly what we did in the study. highlight a couple of the key findings, and then I'll introduce a couple of comments and leave it at that. What we did in the study is we followed two intact cohorts of students. One was an elementary and middle school group that we followed between grades 3 and 8. They came from about 1,500 elementary schools, and it was approximately 90,000 students. The second cohort we followed was a cohort of middle and high school students, about 45,000 students who came from 600 middle schools that were attached to a smaller number of high schools. So it's one of the larger studies of high-achieving learners that's been conducted, and we started with a very large group of students. What we were interested in looking at were basically what happened to three groups of students during the course of the study. One group we characterize as sustainers, and those are kids who started as high-flying and stayed that way throughout the study period. The group that got most of our attention, to be frank, were the descenders, and those are students who started above our threshold, which in this case was the 90th percentile, and at some point, or by the end of their time in middle school or the end of their time in high school, had fallen below the 90th percentile. And then the third group we looked at were late bloomers. That would be students who started below our threshold and by the end of the study were above it. Why the interest in descenders in particular? And this is one place where I'd introduce a comment. The interest in descenders was policy for the last 10 years or more has focused on taking kids who are clearly coming to school with achievement deficits and trying to get those kids up to the point of proficiency. And what we discovered over 10 years is that's hard work. The descenders pose a different problem. These are kids who at one point in time at least, grade 3 or perhaps grade 6, demonstrated that a lack of deficits, if you will. Demonstrated high achievement. They were coming as fully capable learners, and at some point they fell below that. And it struck us as it should be easier to maintain these kinds of kids, or as easy at least, as it would be to bring low achievers up. So we had a special interest in the descenders because it struck us that these are kids that should be, that we should be able to handle, or handle may not be the right word, but kids we ought to be able to support. And the loss of so many is a concern. So just how many did we lose? He said, hoping that the clicker works.
Yes, you click.
There we go. We'll just skip to here. There we go. These are the two cohort groups in reading and mathematics, and as you can clearly see from the 7-point font or whatever it is, in three of the cohorts, about 45% on average of the group that started as high flyers fell out. The one exception to that was the middle school math group. That's a group we followed between grades 6 and 10. And of that group, 70% maintained, while only 30% fell out. So one of the findings in the study, and this was one that concerned us, was that about 3/5 of the high flyers maintain, but there are 2/5 who do not. And while we don't speculate on the reasons that they may be falling off, we came to the conclusion, especially after looking at some issues like how much of this would be attributable to measurement error, for example, we came to the conclusion that more seem to be falling than should be falling. So that's the first finding. A lot of kids sustained, but more than we would like descend. The second finding. How far they fell. And I want to make a comment on this as well. Of those that lose status, one of the things that we said in the study, and this is one where I actually take a little bit at issue with the authors, we said that they don't really fall that far. Of the 43% that lose their status, about 30% stay somewhere between the 75th and the 90th percentile, and then about 13% fall below the 75th percentile. Now, on its face, it may not seem like a big deal. And it's true that the drop in achievement is not a dramatic drop in achievement. But the consequences of the drop may be higher than people think. For example, in many school systems, if you drop below the 95th percentile, you're no longer eligible for gifted programming. In some school systems, if you drop below, say, a 90th percentile performance, you're no longer eligible for honors programming. And I've got 2 college-age daughters, so the thing that was most relevant to me at this point is how much financial aid could you lose if you drop? And this is just one example that we posted in a blog. I'm from the West Coast, so forgive the example. If one wanted to go to Montana State University, and I don't know why you'd want to do that,
Because it's in a really nice place, Bozeman.
Yeah. Bozeman's cool. If you score at the 97th percentile on the SAT, so in other words, you're at the top of our high flyers, you'll automatically get $60,000 over 4 years in need-based aid. That's about 60% of the cost of attendance at the university. If you fall to the 89th percentile, which would have been just below our threshold, you lose $30,000 of that money, $7,500 a year. If you fall to the 75th percentile, which would be just below where the average group ended up that were descenders, that aid goes down to $10,000. So in other words, you lose about $12,500 a year in aid. So if you're looking at the group of descenders, we're looking at a group here that, had they been taking the SAT and attending Montana State, would have been eligible for between $30,000 to $60,000 worth of aid, and lost substantial amounts of that aid due to the fact that they descended. So there are consequences to this, and the consequences of small drops in achievement may be larger than people think. Third finding.
Quickly. You're almost out of time.
Boy, the third finding, and this is the one we'll finish on, is the representative of minority children within the group. If you look at the minority female part of the sample, about 5% of the total group qualifies as high flying. About 4% of minority males, and then you see that the size of the non-minority female and male groups in mathematics are more than double that. We show that for two reasons. One, clearly minority children are underrepresented in this group, and that's something that we think deserves our attention. But second, it also highlights the idea that, at times one looks at this issue and thinks if you're concerned about the needs of high-achieving students, you're concerned about rich Anglo kids. And basically, large portions of these samples are kids who come from schools, from high-poverty schools. And while they're not represented proportionately, many of them are minority students. So when we talk about the needs of high flyers, we're not solely talking about Anglo families or rich Anglo families. We're talking about disadvantaged students as well. So we'll finish on that.
Terrific. When we come back to you later in a few minutes, you can talk a little bit about what you intend to do further with these data, because I know you're not at the end of this analysis.
We would love to.
Josh, you've done something different, but it's relevant. So do you want to explain what you've done and why it's relevant?
Sure. So no commercial?
Well,
I thought everybody was getting a commercial.
Well, if you'd like to watch some more of those guys floating around on kites, we probably could replay it. What's that called? Hang gliding?
Hang gliding.
All right.
So I'm here to talk about the Global Report Card, which is joint work with Jay Green and was supported by the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas. You can find the full results with the technical appendix at globalreportcard.org. So let's jump into this. What's the motivation for the Global Report Card? Lots of the machinery for accountability that we've built over the last few years allows for really good in-state comparisons. So if I'm in Scarsdale, if I'm in Evanston, if I'm in Willamette, if I'm in Plano or Ladue, I can look at large urban districts and compare myself pretty well to them, and I look pretty good. But that's not really, if I'm in one of these elite suburbs, that's not really who I should be comparing myself to. We're in an increasingly globalized world, and as such, our kids are competing in a labor market that is also increasingly globalized. And so the correct comparisons for kids in Scarsdale are not to kids in New York City. They're to kids in Singapore, kids in Finland, kids in Canada. Those are the kids that they're going to be competing for jobs with in the future. So what we wanted to do was to draw that comparison for them. Right now, before the Global Report Card, there was scant evidence that would allow parents to compare the performance of their kids to international competitors. There was some evidence from Hanishek, Peterson, and Luger Vosman. However, this focused on the top achievers and didn't really take it down to the district level. You could do it at the state level, but if I'm in Scarsdale and I'm a parent in Scarsdale, I can look around and say, well, my school is different. That's everybody else that's bringing our average down. And a lot of the survey data out there actually reinforce that. Parents believe that on average the public education system is doing quite poorly, but their district is okay. So what we wanted to do was name their district and show them that they didn't do so well compared to international comparison. So essentially what we did was we took state-level data, we took NWEA, we took PISA, not NWEA, NAEP, and then we took each set of data where you can compare at different levels, and we kind of smashed them all together so that districts could be compared to an international group of economic competitors. And what we found was that a lot of our elite suburbs in the United States perform at a mediocre level. So just to name a few, we highlighted Beverly Hills in our Ed Next piece. They were at the 53rd percentile in mathematics. White Plains, New York, outside New York City, was at the 39th percentile in mathematics. Grosse Pointe, Michigan, outside of Detroit, was at the 56th. I can go on down the list here. Evanston, outside of Chicago, was at the 48th percentile. So the average student in these districts, which have been traditionally suburban havens for parents who wanted to get away from the urban ills in the large cities, have math achievement that is below the average achievement in our comparison group. We did find some pockets of excellence. So it is possible to be excellent. It is possible for the average student at a district to be excellent. Pelham, Massachusetts, their average student was at the 95th percentile. Superb. Spring Lake, New Jersey was at the 91st percentile. Wakanda, Kansas was at the 91st. Highland Park.
Who?
Wakanda. It's very interesting. It's a small rural district. You actually have to Google it to actually figure out where it is.
Have you checked out Oakwood, Ohio? They did pretty well.
Oakwood, Ohio.
Yes.
Do you have an actual number for us?
I looked at it, and I was in the 90s.
There you go. Highland Park, outside of Dallas, is at the 88th percentile. So it is possible to be excellent. Excellence is demonstrated in several communities around the nation. However, the bulk of these suburbs, the bulk of places that have been these havens of the suburban elites, perform less than we would expect. So 13 of the top 20 districts, interestingly, are charters. The rest are mostly rural and small. So I don't know how much that informs our opinions of what it takes to be excellent. In a lot of these rural and small places, to be sure, there's a high amount of randomness that occurs. So some of that could be randomness, but it could be that there are advantages to being small.
Or there might be 11 smart kids.
It could. There's where the randomness kicks in. So there are also pools of failure out there. Washington, D.C. is at the 11th percentile. Detroit is at the 12th. So most of your large school districts are well below the 50th percentile. None of them are above. And they comprise nearly 16% of all students in the United States. So the real point that we want to drive home from this analysis is that there is no real refuge. You cannot be a parent and simply move to a suburb and expect that school to excel, to really push your kids to excel. 4 states have no traditional public school districts above the 50th percentile. 17 states have none in the upper third. More than half of the states have no more than 3 traditional public school districts in the upper third of math achievement when compared to our international comparison group. So this is one of those strongly held beliefs that we want to persuade people is simply not correct.
Thank you very much. So, Rick, you actually wrote this good essay in National Affairs, but I couldn't absolutely make out whether you were decrying achievement gaps in general as a way of thinking, or just the one we've been obsessed with as a problem, or both. Take it away.
Sure. So I wrote an essay in the most recent issue of National Affairs. This up-and-comer Finn had a not bad essay on school boards that you might want to check out. And on
we actually had the forum on that not so long ago, and Ann Bryant somehow wasn't persuaded. But keep right on going.
But you tried. What I talked about what I've come to regard as something called Achievement-Gap Mania. The problem is with the way in which talking about achievement gaps has become the way in which we think and talk about the challenges of school improvement. That actually, it strikes me that being concerned about achievement gaps based on race, based on income, based on gender, in whatever direction, is completely reasonable. It's something that we should pay attention to. However, I have enormous problems with the way in which this has become the only thing that we pay attention to, and that it has become the organizing principle for efforts to talk about school improvement. Nothing surprising here. The Achievement-Gap Mania, and No Child Left Behind, I tend to think of as one manifestation of this rather than the cause of it. Achievement-Gap Mania it occurred because a substantial number of people got into school improvement because they see it as a mechanism for an anti-poverty agenda, for both good and bad. Schools obviously are one mechanism for helping to address issues of poverty, but it seems to me that schools going back 3 millennia have a broader and more substantial mission than that, and that to try to reduce schools to nothing more than an engine of combating poverty is to both impoverish the purpose of education and to define schooling in a way that is enormously problematic. So that's why I think where we are. The notion, I think most people involved in this conversation will kind of stipulate that most education reform today is framed in terms of achievement gaps. If not, you can look at the article. I think any number of initiatives, any number of funding priorities are justified in terms of achievement gaps. And I would suggest that it's simply having its intended effect. That the fact that some high flyers are losing altitude, it would strike me as a natural consequence of focusing on achievement gaps, because time, instructional talent, resources are limited. For us to make a decision to focus these on some children, and in some ways, is to make a decision to take those resources away from other children and at other times. For instance, when you survey teachers, when asked which children at their school are the highest priority, and when teachers are told they're allowed to identify more than one group, 60% of teachers in 2008 indicated that it was low achievers who were the highest priority, and 23% said it was high achievers. When asked which children they were most likely to spend one-on-one time with, 80% of teachers said low achievers, 5% of teachers said high achievers. This strikes me as a natural consequence. Now, the question is it a good thing? It's certainly reasonable to argue that schools ought to put their thumb on the scale and pay more attention to children who come from from disadvantaged circumstances than their more fortunate peers. However, I have an enormous concern if that becomes the only way that we're thinking and talking about school improvement. And I'm particularly concerned that we have not actually forced policymakers and advocates and school leaders to wring their hands in making these decisions. That it has been all too easy to simply assert that good teachers, that new dollars ought to be going to the most disadvantaged children, and to ask questions about this, to inquire into the consequences for other children, has either been dismissed or even simply lambasted as a racially motivated query. So for instance, I'm a big fan of former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and I think a lot of what they did in Florida was terrific. It strikes me as peculiar that nobody ever remarks on the fact that one element of Jeb's gap closing strategy was that any teacher in Florida who has so much as one child who's an English language learner has to do 60 hours of ELL professional development. And English teachers in Florida have to do 300 hours of professional development in English as a second language. If you presume that teachers have not an infinite amount of time and energy, and if we have limited resources, this strikes me as something we should think about. A couple other consequences. Again, I don't think this is a consequentialist argument. My point's not that we need to worry particularly about whether high flyers are descending or not, because it strikes me that the logic of Achievement-Gap Mania is to focus in certain ways. One, it has narrowed the scope of instruction, because achievement gaps are measured in terms of reading and math scores. Hence, that's where we focused. Second, it has created a dramatic urge for democratization, getting children who are demographically representative into various tracks. Now, my friend Jay Matthews argues that done sensibly, this is terrific, and I agree. On the other hand, Mark Schneider, colleague of mine at AEI, former commissioner of the National Center of Ed Statistics, has pointed it out that from 1990 to 2005, the average student graduating from American high school went from 3.2 to 3.8 math courses. Their GPA in those courses increased from 2.2 to 2.6. That in fact, from 1978 to 2008, we went from 1/3 of students taking Algebra 2 to more than 50% of students taking Algebra 2. And yet, over that time period, from 1978 to 2008, average NAEP scores in Algebra, Geometry, Algebra 2 declined. So we have more students taking more advanced math, getting higher grades, and yet they know less. It strikes me that this is a consequence of allowing ourselves to be deluded into imagining that all students can handle high-level instruction in the current format. Finally, look, I am simply skeptical of the notion that what's good for our worst-off students is good for all students. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds show up at schools with vocabularies 1/4 the size of their more advantaged peers. They've watched much more TV, been read to much less. They have not had a chance to inculcate learning behaviors at home. The notion that sweating the small stuff schools are the right solution for everybody is, I think, misguided. I think there are models and instructional programs that work terrifically well for some children and not for others. And yet, in the course of the past decade, we have consistently held up as the optimal school models schools like KIPP and Uncommon and Achievement First that I have enormous regard for, but we've somehow suggested that these are the answer for our children. And I think that's wrong. I think they are a terrific tool for some children, and I think we have spent little time or energy trying to figure out what are their counterparts for other children.
Thank you very much. Ulrich, I think you've been provided with plenty of material.
Yes, I would agree. And serving the role as a grump, I want to start with a simple figure. In Detroit in 2009, only 3% of the low-income 8th graders scored proficient in math. Okay? That means that only around 130 8th graders in the city who are low income were scoring at grade level. And that is a shockingly low number. That is a painfully low number. I think that's a number that we really need to keep in mind, because I certainly agree that our most advantaged students could do better. I applaud the work that we've been seeing up here, but it is really important to keep in mind that our disadvantaged students are lagging way, way, way behind. I want to take just a moment to a few methodological issues that I have with John's work. I mean, so one, when Fordham released the work, and as best as Checker has sort of vacillated on this, they did say that it raises... Vacillate?
Keep going.
Raises some important questions. Might this study raise some questions about No Child Left Behind? And the fact of the matter is, the study does not look at before No Child Left Behind and after No Child Left Behind, so it is very hard to say that the study has anything to do about No Child Left Behind. In fact, it could be true that this has actually gotten better. I mean, we simply don't know. The data in this particular research project doesn't shed a light on this particular topic, in my opinion. I think the second point, and I think in some ways a more important point, and John alluded to it, and actually used the word, John alluded to it saying this is not dramatic, but very specific, when you look at the data, even those students who lost altitude, right, in our commercial, those students who are plummeting for, looked like 3 or 4 seconds, didn't actually plummet that far, right? So they dropped below the 90th percentile, but most of them stayed at the 70th percentile. In other words, this is a non-finding finding. So, in my opinion, the most important finding of the study, actually, is the findings that weren't really particularly highlighted. So high-achieving students are underrepresented in high-poverty schools, this study found. I think that's really quite interesting. The proportion of high achievers in high-poverty schools also declined over time. Again, I think an important finding. And by my grumpiness up here is not to say that this was, by any means, a sort of a terrible study. I mean, it's really interesting. I think many of the findings of it are things that are worthy of discussion. It is just what we're trying to say with that particular study. But then one moves sort of more broadly to the other achievement gap. By that, I do not mean the gap between the two teeth on the promotional brochure. I mean, I want to talk about high-achieving students, whether they've been hurt. Okay? And when you look at the data, the nation's top students have actually been gaining ground in a number of areas. I think it would be great if we had this conversation and we had seen some plummeting in high achievement, in the performance of high achievement students, but we've actually seen the reverse, right? In 8th grade math, from 2000 to 2009, we've seen a 3 percentage point jump. There's also been a jump in the percentage of 4th graders scoring at the advanced level on that math exam. And then more broadly, kind of getting to this access issue, in Rick's National Affairs article, I want to be a grump about everybody. In Rick's National Affairs article, he notes that the number of high school graduates who've taken at least one AP exam increased by 60%, and then quotes teachers saying, they've had issues, that many of these teachers, surveys of teachers who say that many of the students are unprepared for the rigor of AP coursework. But when you look at the data, the College Board reports that a share of students passing has only declined by 4%. So we've seen a 60% increase in the number of students taking AP exams, but only a 4% decrease in the actual performance, which suggests a lot of these students can do the work. So I agree with Josh that affluent schools are resting on their laurels. It is a shame that Scarsdale High School continues to report that I think over 98% of their students are proficient in reading and math. I agree with Fordham that there are a lot of issues with No Child Left Behind. I agree with my friend Rick here that a lot of the talk about the achievement gap has not focused on and truly engaged suburban parents in the reform process, right? We need to reform our schools across the board. And by having some of these conversations, we have not done enough to engage parents. But we've also seen the evidence that accountability works, right? State and federal efforts to hold school accountables has worked. In many instances. Has gone wrong in many instances, but has worked. So we look at 2008, black 9-year-olds were reading 2 grade levels ahead of where they were in 1999. 2008, Hispanic 9-year-olds also handling math problems 2 grade levels ahead of where they were in 1999. We can do better. Looking forward, I believe that states should set both annual achievement goals and gap closing goals for all students. I believe that we also need to rally around common standards because we do need to move beyond the conversation of closing gaps. We need to focus ultimately on having high standards for all students regardless of their family backgrounds.
That was pretty good.
You sound surprised.
Grumpy, but cogent. Thank you very much, Ulrich. Thank you all four. That was actually fascinating, and I think we now take off the gloves and actually pummel each other a little bit if we can, just because that's lots more fun. But first, John, there's this provocative bit in the report that you that actually Ulrich alluded to, but you didn't talk about because you only had 7 minutes. It's the part which says we discovered a surprising and encouraging trend. School poverty was not a strong predictor of student progress. You want to say a little bit about that line of investigation and what you found?
Sure. The study we did actually has 2 pieces to it, and in a longer version, we'll elaborate on the second piece. But what we looked at were not only the top 10% of students in the sample, but the top 10% of students within each of the schools we studied and what happened to them. And we constructed a model to look at the effect of school poverty on the growth rates of students of the top 10% within those schools. What we found was that school poverty wasn't a great predictor of growth. It had a very mild influence on the amount of growth that schools got. And to give you an idea of how mild it was, I'd frame it this way. If I were a parent choosing real estate, trying to decide whether to put my kid move my house to a high-income school district or stay in a lower-income school district. If I put my house in a high-income student school district, I have a roughly 55% chance of choosing a school that would produce above-average growth. If I put my house in a lower-income school district and attended that school, I have about a 45% chance of selecting a school that gets higher than average growth. In other words, the wealth of the school wasn't as great a predictor of growth as we would have thought. And to us, what was most amazing was the spread. You had high-income schools that produced awful growth, to be frank, and low-income schools that produced growth as spectacular as some of the highest-income schools did. So we were surprised at the spread and surprised that income had less effect than it did.
Thank you. And would you also say a word about different rates of growth that you found at the upper end of the spectrum and the lower end of the spectrum? Because I thought that was another pretty significant part of the study.
And now we're talking back again about the first part of the study.
Yes.
But we found that high-achieving learners, especially in reading, show lower rates of growth than low-achieving readers do. Part of that...
Or put differently, low-achieving readers make greater gains.
They make greater gains than high-achieving learners do.
Uh-huh.
In mathematics, not so much of a gap. In fact, the lines stay close to parallel. Low achievers and high achievers seem to make similar progress. We're interested in that as an area for more research because we think it may have something to do with the way the disciplines are structured. That may be the explanation.
And say just one more word about what you intend to do with regard to the longer version.
Well, first explain ourselves more.
Well, you tried in the draft we first saw to explain yourselves at great length.
Yes,
and that was one of the reasons. That was one of the reasons there's a short version.
The second one, I think the question we're most interested in, and I think it speaks to some of the equity issues that Rick's raising. When you get down to the micro level, the school level, everybody's got high achievers within their school. If you look at the top 10% nationally, and then you go to a high poverty school, it's very possible that that school may have only 3 or 4 that meet that qualification. But every school has their own top 10%. And we're very interested in the second half of the study in looking at what happens to the top 10% in each school. When the teacher's standing in front of the kids on a day-to-day basis, they have a moral imperative to look at the achievement of all the kids, including that top 10%. And so in the longer study, the focus is going to be what happens to the top group in each school. And is it different than what we're seeing, with this elite 10, if you will?
Okay, thanks. Josh, when you go below the state level, you obviously cannot use NAEP data to get at Dayton, Ohio versus Oakwood, Ohio, for example. You are dependent upon the Ohio Achievement Test and its equivalent in every state, correct?
Yes.
So how are your findings not skewed by the differing standards, tests, cut scores, etc., of the different states?
So essentially what we do is we assume normality at all levels. And so
in American education, normality?
I know it's a difficult leap, but we assume that student achievement is roughly normally distributed at every level. So on the state achievement test, you get a normal distribution. So essentially what we do is we use the NAEP score to recenter that distribution at the state level. And again, we do the same at the international level. Now, if standard deviation units are relatively similar across states, then it's and normality holds roughly at every level, then we've got a pretty good measure.
Okay.
But it's going to be more difficult in some states than others because Massachusetts has a better test that has more differentiation across the entire ability distribution than, say, Mississippi.
Right. A short test without much distribution or skewed to low-end students or something like that is not going to legitimize your assumption of normality, is it?
I don't think that'll have a whole lot to do with the assumption of normality. You just aren't going to get the measurement that you want at all levels of ability. And
the differentiation of districts within that state.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, of course, we are completely reliant on the state exams. However, I think it works out pretty well. We're roughly equivalent to the urban trial NAEP. So I think that we've done in a lot of places. So I think we've done a reasonable job.
You mean your findings for those cities
are consistent with the urban trial NAEP?
Okay. Ulrich or Rick, have you looked at their methodology, what Jay and Josh used? Do you have any thoughts on that, on whether we can trust it, I guess, is the ultimate question.
You haven't picked a fight with me yet.
I haven't picked a fight. But I can if you want. And that is, I think we see across the board that, when we have looked at Nebraska, which has a notoriously weak exam, where I believe you have over a dozen districts who report in 4th, 8th, and high school more than 100% of all their students are proficient. Your distribution issues seem to get, I would imagine, a little bit squirrely. But I am not sort of a statistician, so I think weighing in on this. But I think what I would say is that we have what I would say is this idea that we are all above average is a problem across our school systems, and I'm glad we're highlighting it.
Okay. Rick, you were sounding a little bit like Debbie Meyer or Diane Ravitch in your dismissal of reliance on test results in reading and math, and your suggestion that we should have a broader, wider, more holistic way of looking at student and school performance.
Well, so I rarely get that, but that's kind of fun. Sure. No, what I'm actually suggesting is that reading, ELA and math assessments are enormously useful for some kids. If we're talking about children who are illiterate or not numerate, then making sure that they've actually mastered those essential skills makes terrific sense. What's striking to me, though, is that I think for the vast majority of middle-class and suburban families, right, and we find this every day, they're not nearly as concerned with reading and math scores as are parents whose children aren't getting those kinds of support at home. Why? Because most middle-class and suburban families seem fairly confident that their kids are going to be about on grade level. In fact, this has become one of the go-tos for differentiated instruction and for school staffing. We have more or less taken to a recipe of leaving kids who are proficient or better to their own devices, give them some stuff to do, give them some learning labs, hope things work out, and concentrate our instructional tools and resources on the kids who, as Ulrich alluded to, are truly worse off. What I think the point here is that by trying to take measures which were entirely appropriate for turning attention to the fact that some kids were getting massively shortchanged, this is where NCLB was enormously useful, that it held up to people the fact that some kids were getting massively shortchanged, that we were treating their needs as an afterthought, that we were staffing without regard to their opportunities. This was what made the push for accountability so powerful in the 1990s and early 2000s. What I'm concerned about, though, is, again, we have imagined that what's best for the worst off children is best for all children. And I think for most children who are reading at grade level, in grade 4 or 6, who are proficient in mathematics, that the right metrics must and should be broader than are they continuing to be on grade level in those skills.
So this is the second time you've said something like, we've assumed that what's needed for low-achieving or disadvantaged kids is the right thing for everybody. Earlier you suggested that the country had somehow decided that everybody should go to a KIPP school. And I haven't sensed that myself. I've sensed that if the country thinks anything about KIPP and Achievement First and these other kinds of high-performing charter chains, it's that they're good for poor kids. I haven't ever heard anybody suggest that a middle-class kid who's already proficient in reading and math would be better off in a KIPP school. Where are you getting that?
So that's not quite what I'm saying. What I am saying is that when you go through and you run searches for schools that get discussed as inspirational, as high performers, as exemplars, that they are massively and disproportionately the KIPPs and Achievement First and the schools that have adopted the sweating the small stuff mantra. The schools that are doing well with other kids tend to get relatively less coverage, tend not to be talked about, tend to be marginalized when it comes to researching what works, tend not to be favored by philanthropies or by federal research dollars.
I think that's true, but I think that's as much a fault of the likes of us, the blogosphere, the research dollars, the evaluation world, as anything else. I mean, the Bronx High School of Science has very few people studying it, and it's a very different place than KIPP. Though they're both in New York. You said something else that was, for you, unusually cryptic. you said something I actually didn't understand about Jeb Bush and ELL and teachers having to spend 1,000 years doing professional development. I didn't get your point at all.
Oh, sure. So the point's that much attention has been paid to Florida's very impressive track record when it comes to closing achievement gaps. Little attention has been paid to some of the costs of doing so. One example of those costs is a teacher who has even one child who's ELL is spending 60 hours of professional development mandated by the state, that all English teachers in the state are mandated to spend 300 hours in ESL professional development. Given how little time we actually we give teachers to do PD on anything, that strikes me as a massive investment of time and energy. It's a perfectly reasonable one, but I hardly ever find us actually wringing our hands and wondering whether or not that is an appropriate allocation of time and dollars.
But is that about achievement gaps, or is that just about the fact that Florida is obsessed with Hispanic immigrants?
Well, I mean, at some point, I mean, this is kind of like how much of this is related to NCLB and not. What I'm suggesting is that we have made it the way we keep score. The schools that get held up as exemplars are those which are doing most impressively with racially and ethnically identifiable subgroups and moving their achievement up, all of which is, again, a good and healthy thing to a certain degree. But what we have paid little or no attention to is what trade-offs that has meant in terms of the ability to move performance in the aggregate or to serve children who are already proficient.
Okay. Ulrich, you seemed fairly serene about high flyers not falling below the 70th percentile. That is to say, what's the big deal if they don't go down further than that? Are you not taken with any of John's arguments about the things kids lose if they fall out of the top 10th?
I think it is important to keep in mind, the way it is presented, right, that the second finding sort of says that they don't fall that far, as John, to use his own words, is not that dramatic. I think it's pretty significant if it's the second finding. So I think using his own words to say that the second finding somewhat, or really, in my opinion, erodes a fair amount of the first finding is, I think, fairly significant. And I think there's a second issue, and it becomes very technical, and perhaps not appropriate, but the bottom line is this is a norm reference test. So you're spreading students out as opposed to measuring them on a criterion, and that's why I think looking at NAEP and looking at percentage of students who are scoring at the advanced level and looking at that over time is a better, I think, way to say, oh, are high-achieving students really getting hurt by pushes for more accountability?
Well, lots of people look at that kind of NAEP analysis over time, but nobody has longitudinal data on NAEP kids. That is to say, you have no idea what's happening to the individuals in that pool, because NAEP doesn't do individual record keeping and NWA does. I mean, the whole point of the study was they had longitudinal data at the individual level, and they were able to track which kids went up, down, or sideways on their own test, which is norm referenced but stable over time. So I don't. Are you suggesting you should use sort of NAEP type analysis instead of this kind of longitudinal study?
What I'm suggesting is not that this study was not worthy of further study, not that this study was not itself sort of rigorous. What I took issue with is to say this study should cause us to have a deep and angst-ridden conversation about achievement gaps and how are our high-achieving students doing in relationship to No Child Left Behind. And I think my issue is with how it was sold, whether or not now I think, as Mike was quoted, it's even elitist to imagine gifted and talented programs. And my issue is getting from the study, point A, to some of these, what I see are X's and Y's because of the, running out of an analogy here.
Yes, you are.
I see issue with that.
Okay, so, okay.
So I'm taking a buy on the technical analysis
Right.
and saying the salesmanship and the promotion of the study does not fit with its actual conclusions.
You should teach marketing. Okay, Josh, what you wanted to add something on this? And then
Yeah, so I actually wanted to kind of take that in a different direction. Ulrich, you took issue with the comment that this focus on achievement gaps may be harming the high flyers. What if it's harming the poor kids? What if by your own words, we've been working on solving the situation of poverty and low achievement in our urban districts for a very, very long time. We've tried lots of reforms, and we still have, you said 3% of 8th graders in Detroit were proficient. That's really, really bad. What if this is just not really the way to achieve fundamental reform? What if we need more focus on the high flyers to really motivate education reform? What if it's the political elites that we need to get off the sidelines, off the benches, and actually into the fight?
You know, I think of it this way. Do you think that there are just a ton of high flyers in Detroit, right? I mean, it strikes me as most likely, and the data suggests no. And then second to that, I mean, I think my issue is that, you know, we have this conversation around No Child Left Behind where folks are saying, oh, too much testing, it's hurting our suburban well-to-do parents, and we are going to then sink a reform, right, that has actually worked. When we look at the achievement of Hispanic students over time, when we've looked at the achievement of African-American students over time, since, you know, I mean, it's hard to then peg the policy specifically to NAEP, but we've seen some evidence, including some that Fordham put together under, with Tom Loves' work, that this has actually worked. And so instead of, in my opinion, pandering to the suburban communities to try and get them up in arms when they have never really thought about sending their students to KIPP, instead we should focus on where the biggest problem is. And the biggest problem that we have in the United States today is not having conversations. I'm not saying that having conversations about federal policy. The biggest issue in the United States today with regards to education is how are we doing with our most disadvantaged students. And I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind here is that often this conversation is it's smart kids versus disadvantaged kids. Right? And that's not the achievement gap that we're talking about. We're talking about advantaged students versus disadvantaged students.
So, can I jump
Yes,
in
because
here?
I was going to ask you, he seems to be persisting with the mania that you are denouncing.
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, that, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that people enter the world of schooling for different reasons. A substantial number of folks who have driven education and reform over the past decade are less involved in schooling because they're deeply fascinated by the work of teaching and learning, and more because they see schools as a powerful anti-poverty device. That's neither right nor wrong. It's simply a differential perspective. Now, I think the trick here is that, you know, so many of these kind of defer types, I would put the Ed Trust absolutely there. I mean, very much by design. I mean, this is why, you know, when the Children's Defense Fund shut down its education arm, the Ed Trust was launched. And this is all perfectly good and healthy. The problem is, if you think of schooling primarily as an anti-poverty program rather than as a place where children learn, a couple things happen. One is you stop being particularly interested in what happens inside the schoolhouse. So you tend to start treating schools as black boxes, teachers as instrumental devices that you're going to reassign, and schooling becomes a place where you move things that seem to impact poverty outcomes. Since what we know how to measure is reading and math scores and graduation rates, the entire education debate becomes about those. It's not that I have a problem with focusing on reading and math performance. It's that when I started out as a high school teacher 20 years ago, I never imagined I was getting into schooling because I thought reading and math scores captured the entirety of what I hoped that children would learn during their time in school. Now, if that's the case, if we understand schooling this way, Ulrich's response seems to be that many suburban and middle-class parents are going to feel that this isn't about helping their kid. And Ulrich's response is, well, they need to deal with it. They need to grow up. They need to understand that there's other more vulnerable children who we're more worried about, and they just need to sit on their hands. I think this has been very much the philosophy of school reform the past decade. 4% of Americans think that their oldest child's school deserves a D or an F. 79% think it deserves an A or a B. We have built a school reform agenda focused on that 4%. That's how we talk about school choice. That's how we talk about accountability. And what that has done is it has very purposefully said to middle-class Americans, this isn't about you. Why are we shocked then to find out that they're not particularly taken with NCLB, that they're not particularly taken with the reforms that we hold up in the blogosphere? Why are they not excited about the models that we talk about as terrific schools? It's because they understand that none of this is about solving the problems and addressing the needs of their children. And it strikes me that schools are the places where democratic and free societies try to cultivate the abilities of all kids.
But this is why Josh's nifty interactive report card is meant to get the attention of everybody all over the country. When are you going to bring it down to the building level, by the way, so that people can see how their own school is doing rather than just their district?
So we actually thought about doing that this past time,
Yes.
and the sample sizes get a little screwed whenever you get down to the building level. So we just didn't do it this time around. We thought that it was good in the initial release not to take it down that far, simply because we would probably get heat for taking it down that far.
Didn't stop you from including those rural districts with 11 kids.
Certainly true. Now, 11 is a little too few. We cut it off at some point, but
You did.
yes, I think Wakanda has around 100.
And that would be around the minimum that you kept in.
I don't think that we kept in lower than that.
Say that again.
We kept in a lower number than that. Our cutoff was lower than.
But you're not going to say what it was.
I think it was 10 per tested grade or something.
Okay. John, you
I want
wanted
to
to
comment
respond.
on
Yes.
what Rick was saying and kind
Yes.
of reinforce one aspect of it.
He's still sounding like Debbie Meyer, in my opinion, but you go right ahead.
I guess I put it this way. To me, the most I work with a lot of teachers, and to me, the most bothersome part of NCLB for teachers, and it goes back to the survey data that you cited. 86% of teachers in the survey said that their moral imperative in the classroom was to treat all students equally. And if you look at the effect of No Child Left Behind, I think largely because of the metric it enforced, basically what it tells teachers is your obligation is to fix a certain identified population of bubble kids. Those are kids who are performing near a standard and kids who are members of a subgroup that they have to save. What that requires the teacher to do then on a philosophical level is violate their moral imperative. And what's interesting in conversations with teachers about it, I think that's, in some ways, that's what they found most uncomfortable about the law, is that the law is actually requiring them to focus on some students at the expense of another. I think you can argue about federal policy and say it may be okay to have federal policies that favor some groups over another, but to take those policies and then move them into a classroom and say, therefore, this teacher has to focus on someone rather than another, I think that starts to violate that moral imperative. A better approach would be to say, perhaps these kids need a side program, or high achievers deserve a side program. But inside the classroom, teachers really feel strongly that everybody should be treated the same.
So a question I was meaning to ask you earlier, let me just circle back to it. There's always going to be a top 10%, right? So why should we care if the kids in it aren't the same kids? That is to say, you've got more kids rising into it than falling out of it. What's the big deal?
Well, any standard you set for high performance is going to be, to some extent, arbitrary. And actually, one of the misunderstandings of the study is we chose the top 10% because that generally would signal eligibility for honors programs or the possibility of getting into gifted programs. We then grounded that in the scale. So the way we set up the study wasn't to have winners and losers. We said, here's the starting point.
Yep.
And then from this starting point, as long as you get over the appropriate scale score during the time of the study, you can you're in the pool, so to speak. So what that means is, as we cited, over the course of the study, more kids actually entered than left. We ended up with more high achievers than we started with, and I guess the point being, we didn't want to establish winners and losers. What we wanted to look at is what happened to kids relative to a set scale point. And the concern is we had too many descenders. The good news was we had more winners than we expected to, more late bloomers.
And you had more rising than falling.
More rising than falling.
Yeah. So it's not that you have more than 10% of the kids in the top 10%. It's that you fixed a score above which anybody would be regarded as a high scorer. And the question was which kids and how many of them made it in and stayed in that place.
Right.
Okay.
Technically, we're not a norm reference test. We reference our test to a scale, and then we provide norms relative to the scale. So we don't actually test to get a spread. We test to get as accurate a measurement as we can of the kid's achievement level, and then find the spread once we have that.
You know, conceptually, one way to think about this is if you're thinking about a race, and there's always going to be people who are the top 10% of the pack in the path running the race. Some of those runners might have the ability to run a 4-minute mile. Not all of them. The top 10% cutoff might be everybody who can run a 5 or 6-minute mile. The question is it important to us in terms of national competitiveness, in terms of cultivating the skills of our population, that those students who have the ability to run that 4-minute mile reach that threshold, and not just that we have some percentage over the. And that's a question that we don't spend a lot of time wrestling with.
Yes, and that's well said. But it also you just let a different cat out of the bag that I was going to give you just a little bit of grief about anyway, and then we're going to open it up to the group in just a minute. And by the way, those who are the thousands across the country that are watching over the internet can send in questions if they send them to questions@edexcellence.net. That's questions@edexcellence.net. And then through the wonders of modern technology, somebody will scribble the question on a piece of paper and bring it up to me after it comes in through the internet. We are really a completely integrated high-tech environment here. Hasn't every education reform in the history of the United States been instrumentally related to economic issues of one kind or another? Rick, you just gave voice to the international competitiveness one, but earlier you were grumping a bit that the anti-poverty one had such traction in K-12 education policy. Name me an important education reform of the last 50 years that hasn't been justified to the public and to policymakers and to voters and taxpayers as having something to do with the economic well-being of the country.
Oh, just about all of them are.
They are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but so I think what's different here is not that it's just part of the sales pitch.
Yes.
That it actually, and one way to think about this is it strikes me that the logic of the achievement gap enthusiasts is really remarkably similar to, say, the folks who staffed OEO under President Johnson or the architects of the Great Society. That they're well-intentioned, that they have identified people who truly have gotten dealt a lousy hand and are trying to do what they can to promote equity and social justice. But Tocqueville, I think, had this right, that America is a nation where what works tends to be self-interest properly understood. And just like the overreaching of the Great Society eventually, 10, 15 years downstream led to the Reagan Revolution and the undoing of much that its architects had hoped for, I think a failure to take seriously the need to serve all of our children, to be responsive to the real and legitimate concerns of middle-class families, is taking what I think are a number of smart and good ideas around accountability and choice and teacher quality, and potentially setting them up for that same kind of failure.
The one thing that I'd point out here, or well, just to point out one, is that the emphasis on reading and math is not because of achievement gaps, right? I mean, we could overly emphasize reading and math scores independent of achievement gaps, right? I mean, we had accountability systems where people grumped, to use Checker's word, in which they did not use achievement gaps, but still were focused on reading and math scores. So I do really fear that, and some of this concern is, we see in an education system not working, not doing enough to serve all students, and so we see policy makers, reaching out for various levers that they can potentially pull. And my fear about Rick's argument is now everything is like it's achievement gap mania. Reading and math scores, because it's the achievement gap. When, the fact is the achievement gap in the United States remains a serious and really concerning issue. To use your own language, the mile-wide chasm that is our own domestic achievement gap, this is Fordham's, America's white and Asian students perform among the world's best. Our black and Hispanic students are battling it out with OECD's worst. And I think when we still think about the size of the achievement gap, and we understand that, or at least my argument here is that we are attributing too many sort of side effects to poor policy implementation. I mean, we could use any number of examples of laws that were passed in which educators or healthcare or anything else decided to regulate too much around professional development. So this concern about the Florida example, in my mind, is also just sort of
no, so let me make a concession here because
okay.
I have part
I'm
but
excited
the
for
concessions. Yeah.
Concession coming, and then
So-
Josh is going to apologize for having tried to focus on wealthy suburban high districts.
So maybe more clarification, but certainly, nothing I'm saying should be taken to suggest that I want to see us retreat from being transparent and clear about performance on ELA and math. So I certainly support that. When it comes to ESE reauthorization, I certainly endorse requiring the assessment. It's true that I'm against federal accountability requirements here. I don't think, but so I think that's a point well taken. Let me give you an example, though, a very concrete example of I think the kind of policy that has alienated middle class and suburbs. Actually, so you guys were involved in this with Ed Trust, right? One of the proposals is what we call the more equitable distribution of teachers, which you guys suggest. And the problem here is that if we're trying to systematically identify good teachers so that we can move them systematically with encouragement or mandates from the federal government into classrooms and schools serving low-income children. On the one hand, that makes all the sense in the world. It's a reasonable and certainly admirable attempt to make sure that those kids get access to good teachers. The flip side of it is what you were saying to middle-class parents is we want to systematically strip mine your schools of your kids' favorite teachers and go give those teachers to someone else. I got to tell you, the only viable political strategy for getting broad-based support of school reform on that premise is to get those middle-class parents drunk. This is very explicitly an effort to advantage some kids at the cost of the others. At a minimum, we should wring our hands and argue about this in a way we haven't. At a maximum, I'd like to see us spend more time on strategies for growing the pie on the number of good teachers and less worrying about how do we reassign the limited number of teachers who we have who we think are terrific.
The Senate Help Committee is going to get this all straightened out tomorrow, by the way.
and they're going to use language like strip mine. Though I do think that the person who should become a marketing expert, though, is Rick.
Yes, he should. And in some ways he already is. Isn't your real beef, Ulrich, more with Josh, though, and the focus that he and Jay have tried to lay on Scarsdale? And the suggestion that the country is focused on either the wrong problem or only part of the problem?
I have a lot of beefs with Jay Green. And
everybody does.
Everyone does. On this study, I do think, and Rick highlighted this point, that we have not done enough in this country to highlight that the education reform crisis is really a crisis across the board. I personally, is my view. I think there's plenty to suggest that it is a crisis beyond this particular study. When you look at Dartmouth College, offers a remediation program. That's remarkable.
Shame on them.
Well, shame on them, perhaps.
Think about the students they didn't accept.
But either way, right, they're accepting. They are highly, highly selective, and yet still the students who come in there are not prepared to do the work, and that's an outrage. And so, in my mind, I really have no issue with highlighting, with broadening the idea of what the crisis is. I do think, though, that this, and to push back a little bit against Rick, I do feel like our proposal there was mischaracterized, but even more broadly, just to speak about, we do have a lot of input issues, whether it's teachers or whether we look at the fact that schools serving mostly black students are twice as likely to have new teachers than schools serving mostly whites. Latest OCR data shows that 3,000 schools across the U.S. Don't offer Algebra 2. More than 7,000 don't offer calculus. I mean, this idea that we're offering an equal opportunity to students is simply not true, and we need to do more to make sure that all students have an equal opportunity for a robust education.
The questions are flooding in over the internet, and I'm going to read the first one that was given me that I think is worth asking. And then, please, the rest of you in the room should be ready to ask your own questions. So, our correspondent says, being labeled a high achiever is only the first step on the road to success. Eventually, we need not only high achievers, but very high achievers. These represent perhaps 1% or even less of the population. Yet they will create a disproportionate number of inventions and wealth. Any comments on how the focus on the achievement gap affects this smallish but extremely important group?
Sure. Probably the one thing I wish Rick had talked about is that the problem of the achievement gap isn't just a problem of achievement gap. It's a problem of selection of metrics. We chose a metric of evaluating kids based on efficiency, or proficiency, I should say, and then looked at differential counts of kids to evaluate the effectiveness of schools, and the standards we use to do that are almost universally low. Who ends up getting hurt in that equation? Well, if you're in Mississippi, where the standard's at about the 10th percentile, it's the 90% of kids who perform somewhere above that standard, and of course the 1% are entirely out of sight. One thing that's kind of interesting, and it only marginally addresses the question, but it does. The move toward evaluating teachers using value-added models changes the metrics substantially. Because it actually, in order to be successful in a value-added model, you actually have to pay some attention to all kids, and theoretically that even includes the performer at the top 1%. So I'm curious as to see whether all this teacher effectiveness stuff and value-added measurement that's going on are going to change the calculus a little bit, because the metrics are really going to change substantially.
Incidentally, does your adaptive test and scale do a good job at the tippy top of high-achieving kids and being able to report on their growth?
We do pretty well until you get to about 10th grade.
Until about 10th grade. Okay. Any other comments on this question? If not, the floor is open. Let's see some eager hands. Susan Sclafani, hello.
Do you want me to go to a thing or just...
I think you might need a mic in order to be broadcast to the world.
Well, I'm Susan Sclafani, working with the Pearson Foundation on a digital curriculum, which will get at some of these issues because it'll allow kids to go farther, faster than others. But my experience in the international realm really makes me ask why we are not focused, as China is, on both an elite and a mass strategy. Because without both of them, we're going to dramatically fall behind. And it's this 1%, it's the 10%. And, of course, in China, not only do they have special schools for the 10%, but they have special floors within them for the top 1%. And we are simply ignoring these kids who can make the greatest contributions to STEM areas, to innovation, and to economics. So why aren't we doing that?
From each according to his abilities, I guess, is the Marxist explanation for that approach to an education system. Okay, why are we not? Because Ulrich won't let us? Because Rick doesn't think it's a good idea? Because John's test isn't adapted to it? Or because Josh's new report card isn't that sensitive?
So, what Susan's really asking is about the walking and chewing gum strategy. And at one level, this seems like it is a no-brainer. That, yes, we should do both of these things. We should do, in fact, right, if we think about schools as an institution that serve a number of crucial purposes, raising new citizens to shoulder their responsibilities, creating a sense of cohesion and shared culture. That there's a number of things that schools have historically been asked to do across, a swath of societies. And it's, absolutely an important part of that in the modern American context is trying to ensure that kids who got dealt a lousy hand early in life have an opportunity to succeed. Nothing I'm saying about Achievement-Gap Mania is meant to dismiss or belittle that. That is a good and reasonable and important thing. My concern is that it has become an overwhelming thing, which has pushed everything else out of the boat. And Andy Rotherham, and I wrote a piece on this maybe 4 or 5 years ago, that if you go back to, say, the National Defense Education Act in the late 50s, that our history in terms of particularly of federal policy is we are not very good at walking and chewing gum. What we tend to do is, because the nature of the politics is that you tend to assemble a winning coalition, is that it tends to swing back and forth from competition to equity and back again. And partly I think that's that's the price we pay for trying to fix these things through policy, rather than regarding the federal role as an opportunity to create room for people to meet an array of needs for a variety of children across the land. Just to take one example, when we think, for instance, about innovation, if we think about the I3 criteria for that $650 million, that it was almost entirely around the kind of metrics that are going to favor gap closing schools, reading and math scores, graduation rates, with a particular focus on gap closing. You would think that is good and important. And I'm heartily endorse the fact that foundations and the feds are investing in these schools. But if you think about opportunities to really come up with new ways of serving student populations in terms of world languages, in terms of advanced math and sciences, in terms of opportunities that children have to be ahead of themselves in order to take advantage of, it's hard to think of either federal dollars or major foundations which have much interest, if any, right now in investing in those kinds of opportunities. And it strikes me, therefore, that the key is, again, that we should want to walk and chew gum. But I am certainly not suggesting we abandon this emphasis. But we do need to start thinking about how do we place our bets more broadly.
Any other comments on this one?
I think Josh's study speaks to some of it, and I find myself wondering, when you talk about the top 1%, it's not just, being the top 1% isn't just a matter of talent, it's a matter of hard work. And when you look at parents in suburban schools, I'm not sure that they're interested in their kids working that hard. One of the things that was, here's one of the things that was most striking to me. My kid attended a Jesuit school.
Is this your N of 1?
This is an N of 1.
Okay.
But it's an illustration.
He's got perfect information, though.
Yeah. It's an N of 1. She attended a Jesuit school where you can take 3 years of college math while you're there. You can take up through numbers theory. It wasn't the Anglo parents that were pushing for that. It was the parents of the Intel engineers who are first generation from China or India who were pushing for that. If the market, and Josh is really describing the market, I think, in a sense, in their study, isn't pushing for this kind of thing, that makes it less likely it's going to happen.
Although, Matt Iglesias, the blogger, with CAP, I thought had offered a terrific insight on this a few months back. He pointed out that, look, if you're walking around and everybody on the streets is 5'2", you're going to feel like you're doing pretty well if you're 5'6". If, on the other hand, you realize, 5'6" isn't that tall, you might think differently. Part of the way we think and talk about school, educational challenge in the U.S. today, when whether it's Waiting for Superman or Stephen Brill's Class Warfare, or Secretary Duncan's kind of admirable turns in the bully pulpit, is we are talking about those Detroit schools that Ulrich alluded to, and this makes it very easy, I think, for the vast majority of American parents to say, well, maybe my school's not perfect, but woof, thank God it's not busted, and they then go about their business.
But the thing to keep in mind here is that we do have already a two-track system, right? I mean, we do see within the current system that, for the most part, students who come from affluent families who are white get an access to a far greater and robust education, even if it is not good enough, than other students. And so I think there are perhaps ways that we can discuss other ways of doing things, and I don't want to dismiss them. I think Rick is right that the fear of engaging in that, but past as a future predictor of performance suggests that we've actually had a two-track system for a very long time, and it's worrisome to try and say, we're going to continue to split this up. And there are all sorts of other efforts going down to the introduction of the IQ test in the United States with Lewis Terman in the 1930s, where this idea of tracking the United States best and brightest tends not to work. The only thing that effort produced, which is still going on today, was I Love Lucy. And so I think more broadly speaking,
you got to explain that.
Oh, well, I thought that if we use NAEP, we throw it around loosely.
6 degrees of separation between Terman and Lucy.
Actually, I think it actually might be 1 degree of separation.
Okay.
And here it goes. In the 1930s, a guy named Lewis Terman introduced the IQ test.
Everybody knows that. Now link it to Lucille Ball.
Absolutely. I'm getting there. Here's how it goes. He identifies the nation's best and brightest, as I was continuing my sentence. And, checker, one of his best and brightest was the writer for I Love Lucy.
The writer.
So that is how it's connected. He did, of course, miss Nobel laureates and all sorts of other people who went to go on and become what we, more traditionally think is our 1%. And so my point in pushing back a little bit is, one, we do have a 2-track system already, and 2, I think many of these efforts to try and quantify what our 1% can do can often be misguided.
So, Ulrich, just to push back on that a little bit, if we go to the post-war period, you'll see an increasing focus and increasing number of dollars going towards poor kids. So we've tried that for an awfully long time, too, and we're actually falling behind both with poor kids and the top kids.
We've got Detroit up to 3%.
Right. Yeah, so we're making headway, I guess. But we've been trying that for a very long time, too, so maybe we should try something different. That doesn't seem to be working either. I don't know how more of the same political focus will solve the problem.
Okay, let's see if there's another question in the room.
Sure.
Yes, sir. You. Yes, you.
Dylan Scott with Governing Magazine. We've had a lot of allusions to policy, and particularly policies that we don't like. And so I was just interested from the perspective of, our readers who are largely state and local governments. What would be a good response to, in terms of policy to this information, or I know that's pretty broad, but also, or how do we have to reimagine policy to kind of address the information that's been presented in this study?
That's a really good question. It's the answers are handicapped slightly by the fact that NWA didn't attempt to attribute causation to the phenomena that it reported on. So we don't actually know what happened within the schools or elsewhere in society to give rise to this decline, as it were. But I think the floor is open for anyone with good policy advice or good policy sense.
Sure, I'll give you 3. One is let's not just talk about proficiency. Let's talk about growth. Let's talk about bang for the buck when it comes to school. Right, 80% of American households don't have a child at home. We want that 80%. We want those 80% of households to actually feel invested in the process. Mostly, what they're worried about is property values and the impact of other people's kids getting educated on them and their taxes. Let's talk about whether or not we're getting bang for the buck. What this means is that states, in measuring school districts and schools, ought to be insisting upon, and Ulrich's done terrific pioneering work here, ought to be insisting upon measures of what's happening in terms of the dollars invested in terms of the measured outcomes. Second, let's talk about growing the pool of teachers. Teach for America is a fantastic organization. I have enormous respect for them. They bring in 4,000 teachers a year into the nation's schools. They only try to staff hard to staff schools in 23 districts. There are, we know from survey data, we have 1.5 million 4-year grads a year, 1.5 million 4-year grads a year, and we know a substantial number are interested in teaching, but not necessarily interested in teaching in the hardest to serve schools and communities. Yet we have made no substantial effort to create non-traditional avenues and a recruiting focus on bringing these folks, particularly in world languages, science, or math, into the nation's schools in the past 20 years. This would seem an easy opportunity to grow the pool of good teachers at our disposal. Third, most of what passes for innovation today is not very innovative, mostly because it's focused on the most vulnerable children. And just like in a public health trial with a new drug, you tend not to take the biggest health risks and throw spaghetti against the wall and hope it hurts. So when you look at what passes for innovation, they tend to be schools which use a relatively pat formula. A long extended school day and school year, very vigorous adult-centric instruction, a lot of formative assessment. These are terrific schools. I have a lot of regard for them. But if you were going to look at hybrid models, if you're going to look at digital learning, strikes me the place you're actually going to experiment with these is not with the most vulnerable kids, but in the kinds of middle class and suburban schools and communities where even if it doesn't work as intended, the kids are probably still going to ultimately be okay. Yet, when you look at federal research priorities, when you look at what foundations are investing their dollars in, they have little or no interest in actually doing experimentation and innovation in those kinds of settings.
Your first point, incidentally, about essentially efficiency or effectiveness suggests a very interesting joint project that Ulrich and Josh should take up, because Ulrich has this nifty district-level sort of ROI analysis, and Josh has this nifty district-level world competitiveness analysis.
One analysis to rule them all.
We need a meta.
I like where you're going.
We need a meta-analysis that is going to merge the sort of ROI concept that CAP has developed with the how are we doing against the world analysis that Josh and Jay have developed. And then we probably wouldn't need any more research ever on anything because we know everything that needs to be known. Does anyone else want to volunteer a policy answer to the last question that was asked? Okay, more questions. Rashawn. Mike.
Rashawn Biddle, Dropout Nation. Of course, a good portion of you know who I am. Infamous, but here's the question.
Never mind you. What's the question?
Well, of course. Here's the question. We're, again, this whole argument about Achievement-Gap Mania. Doesn't this ultimately get past the argument that ultimately, at the end of the day, what we have is a system that has not worked for anybody's children. Hasn't probably worked for anybody's children for the past 50 years, probably 100 years if we had data. And that ultimately all this argument about mania, about whether to focus on the achievement gap, whether not to focus on the achievement gap, whether to focus on high-performing students, really just kind of, it's all getting beside the point, which is you need to deal with the structural issues in the first place.
But aren't you slightly overstating the point? Hasn't the system worked for everybody in this room, for example?
Believe me, a lot of us would say it worked despite the system.
Well, all right. A fundamental savage slashing attack on the system. Anybody want to take this on?
So I guess that was kind of the point that we tried to make with our study is how do you fix the structural problems, right? I mean, it's trying to get at politically, how do you make that happen? What we've been doing for the last 30, 40 years hasn't worked quite as well as we had hoped. So maybe we should try a different strategy.
Quite as well.
It's interesting because Rashawn and I have had a relatively heated exchange online, but I agree 100% with that. I mean, I think to Checker's point, it's worked for us. The system's worked for us in the sense, particularly that people always wind up at the front of the queue and the back of the queue. And I think Ulrich is right that in recent decades, family wealth and circumstance have absolutely played a substantial role in who winds up at the front of that queue. But I am consistently underwhelmed in the way that y'all's study identifies, Josh, consistently underwhelmed that we're actually doing a lot to add value for children anywhere across the spectrum of abilities. And I think, a couple of recent books I've done, same thing over and over in Education Unbound, make exactly this argument that most of our debates tend to be relatively small beans. It's about stuff like mayoral control and extended learning time and the proper use of value-added assessment and teacher evaluation, but all of which take for granted the schools and the teachers and the districts that were put in place 150 years ago, which made a fair bit of sense 150 years ago, but which are probably not particularly well situated to serving any of our kids today. And I think the consequences of that play out differently for kids with different needs. But I think, we lose out across the board because we keep trying to figure out how do you take this old, anachronistic, rusty jalopy and make it do something it was never designed to do.
My only concern with this, and I've worked with Rick in ways of trying to create more innovative education systems and really trying to think broadly, and by that means that in many ways have just ridden on his coattails, where I think he's ridden.
We all have.
Written very eloquently about innovation. The issue that I have is that this pushing out right now of sort of Achievement-Gap Mania and NCLB is overreaching, is that it has very serious consequences. And I think this conversation that, we need to redo everything, which to some degree I agree with, at the same time, it is very important when there are Tea Partiers up on the Hill we're facing markup who really want to just do away with testing, with even reporting subgroups, things that I think many of us, Rick and I, would share as something that we still need to do. And so I do want to sort of warn about a danger of being a little bit too freewheeling, even in these debates.
So if there are any Tea Partiers watching, consider yourselves warned. At the very least, convert to the Green Tea Party.
And did the NEA just get read into the Tea Party?
Yes. Yes.
I would not quite go that far, and that was certainly not my meaning. But I do, whatever. I think I made my point pretty clear.
Yes, you have.
Thank you.
Any of you had a leftover point that you were itching to make that you haven't had a chance to make? If not, it's a gorgeous day out, and there's a party on the roof, and everybody should come to it and have a drink and buttonhole these guys and give them as much grief as possible over their drink. And in the meantime, why don't you join me in thanking them for a very good panel? Thank you all. Thank you, audience around the world. We are dismissed.